Hi friends, welcome to day 9 of our watercolor tip a day series for World Watercolor Month. Today we're layering color to build depth, softness, and dimension. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Alright, so today we're going to be talking about layering or glazing in watercolor and how to create those soft edges. So layering is what gives watercolor its depth and that sort of glow and that dreamy softness. So we're going to start with a couple quick drills just to get a feel for it, and then we're going to use those same ideas. I thought we could paint like a simple zinnia because this is such a great flower. It's so layered and you'll really be able to see how to layer. I also have this gerbera. I never know how to say that. But anyway, I also have this one. This is a great one to also practice with. So we'll see where it takes us. But let's do some quick drills. So the first thing we're going to do is we can either paint some little circles or maybe even some raindrops and sort of just start layering them. And then this is going to show you how transparency works. So I'm just going to mix up some yellow over here, and I'm going to use some colors that kind of blend together so that you can see how they also mix when they're layered. So I'm just going to start with just a simple circle. And we're just going to lay that on. And again, this is, you can play with the transparency of this. Again, you can go back to that water control demo that we had a few days ago. And the trick with this is letting it dry completely. So you don't want any blooms or bleeding with this. You don't want to work wet into wet. This, you want it to be completely dry before you go to the next layer. Some red circles over here, and you could do any size you want. So I'm going to do some that are dark and then some that are super transparent. So this one might be a little bit more of an orangey red, and I want to add a little bit more water into that so that it's a little bit more transparent so you can see through. And then you can sort of see how the different layers create different colors as well. To make a perfect circle, man, it's a little bit difficult, huh? This pinky tone color. So we're just making these circles. And I love my rosy colors. Some Winsor & Newton Opera Rose is my jam. It's so beautiful. Alright, so we've got a few circles here. Now we can work on layering them. Once these are completely dry, then you can go on to the layering process. I'm going to just quickly, and then I'm going to sort of overlap these. So I've got some red over here, and I want this to be pretty transparent so that we can see through and see the color that it's going to create. So I'm going to overlap. And I'm going to just lift that up a bit. And then you can slightly see here how there is a little bit of orange going on there. Maybe I'll do a bit of purple over the red so you can see a little bit better how that works. So you can see here right in this area where you're creating that additional layer, and this is how you're going to build shadows. You can add depth, you can change the tone, you add details. So layering or glazing is super important when it comes to watercolor. Of course, I want to go over with this one and see what happens. But the trick is that the bottom layer, again, it needs to be completely dry for this technique to work. Otherwise, you're going to start getting that wet into wet, blotchy colors. We should try some blue over here. Just kind of picking up anything in my palette. Look how pretty that color is. But this is just a great way to practice, and this also helps you learning sort of color theory and such. So super awesome drill to play with, and you can do as many as you want. Really depends on how much you want to practice, but this is fun. It's fun, and you can do this with fruit or anything and make it a whole like pretty picture. So I'm going to show you how we're going to create a soft edge. I want to do a color that we can see best. So say you wanted to paint a petal. you're going to want this to sort of dry out. So I'm going to leave that there, and then I'm going to show you on one of these how we can sort of soften up that edge. This one's fairly wet still. We don't want it to be completely dry. We want it to be fairly wet. And then you're just going to run your brush over that edge there, and that's going to give you a really feathered out, soft edge. And that one might be a little too dry, so this is where you want to kind of work a little bit quicker. So now this one is still damp, so we're able to run that water right over that edge there. And this is a clean brush. We're just slightly touching the edge of that petal. And then you can blend that all together if you want. If it's too dry, you can blend it out. This is sort of like a wet into wet, so we'll just do a strip of color here. You don't want it to create that line here that we have. You want it to still be fairly wet, and then you're just going to touch that edge and create that feathery, soft, beautiful line there. Yeah, that's how you're going to feather out those edges. So if you don't want any harsh lines, just work a little quick. And that is basically what feathering is. So I figured we can sort of go into the anatomy of this flower here and do some layers, so I could better show you how we can layer a subject. So I'm gonna actually go in with I love this brush. It's great for like the actual petals of, say, a zinnia, because they're literally like that. That is literally the shape. So we're gonna do that. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna start with that bottom layer. I have a magenta color here. It is Permanent Magenta by Winsor & Newton. I don't want it to be like a color thing. I just want to mix it up because it's pretty, but you could use any color that you want. For this bottom layer, we're going to want it to be pretty translucent because we're going to build up layers. So if you have a dark layer on the bottom, you're not going to be able to build layers on top of it unless you use like a super dark color, and then you sort of can't add detail on. So you always want to start lighter. So this mixture here is great for the bottom, and then I'm just going to mix up a little over here just so I can have it ready. And I'm just going to add a little bit of that violet into it, just to deepen it up a bit for the top layers. And I'm not going to do like a perfect zinnia right now, but we'll play. So let's drop down a bit of a brown center here just to get that center. And we're just going to do some stippling here, which we're going to go over stippling in a few lessons. But we're just going to make that center. I'm dropping in some more of a darker color in there. Create that variation. And then I'm going to go back in with my brush here, and I'm going to pick up that lighter mixture. They might have blended together, but you just add a little bit more water over here. And I'm not going to go straight into the flower. I'm going to go around, and I'm going to leave a little bit of space. I'm going to press down my brush and sort of like lift and twist it a bit. And you see how light and transparent that is? I'm just going to kind of do that around the whole flower. And you could use a round brush for this as well. But the point is to kind of show you the layers, obviously. So we've got this. And you can also, with this bottom layer, you can definitely add in some more depth at the tips there, but don't go too dark, because again, you're going to want to be able to go over this. And I'm sort of just leaving space here because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter right now where it goes, because this is going to be covered for this particular flower anyway. So then we want this to be completely dry. So that is the trick. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in and we're going to darken up that color. And this is great for water control again, how we went and we just kept adding a little bit more water, a little bit more water. So I'm using a little bit of violet to darken up my magenta, and then I'm just going to sort of go over this. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going to add them in between you know, so they are just sort of stacked, like layered. And you can see already we're creating a layered effect. And this is how we will do that in watercolor. Layering takes patience, and I don't have patience. I love a loose, expressive painting, but this is such an essential thing. So sit on your hands, use a heat gun if you don't want to wait, but it is super important that we do have a dry layer to work with. And yeah, at this step, you might want to add in some different variations right into those leaves so they're just not solid. You can go back into them after, but it's always best to, you know, play with your layer and make it how you want it before you're finished with it. I'm just going to hit it with the gun again for time. And now you're also seeing in real time that these layers always dry a little bit lighter. So that's one little tricky thing about watercolor. I mean, after time you kind of get used to it and you kind of know. So I'm going to switch to, it's still a filbert, but it's a little bit smaller. And I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to go in between and stack. And then you're really going to start to see the layering. And you can change the colors up a bit. If you can still see this over here, it's a little bit pink. And then there's some greens in there. You know, if we were really going into the painting a zinnia, we would go more into depth with that. So maybe we can add a little bit of that green in there. Do I have that mixed up? No. So let's add a little bit of yellow, mix up a tiny bit of green, and I'll put that in there while it's still a little damp so that they kind of blend together, because I like that look. So we got a little bit of green in there, but you can see these back layers are lighter, and then these ones on top, they're getting a little bit darker. I'm going to hit this again with the gun, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my final little inside pieces here, and those I want to be like that butter consistency, so they really pop out in the front. And they're smaller, and they're sort of angled more towards us. So I'm just going to hit it with a little bit of a, you know, it's not so perfect. And some might be a little twisted and on the side, and some might be sort of facing up. And now that these back layers are dry, you can go in and you can sort of tap in those open spaces if you want and add in. So I have some purple left, and sort of add in those very light petals. Just fill in those spaces just with those little tapping motions. And you can also sort of implement, maybe if you want a little bit more deepness on the bottom, you can implement some bleeds in there so that it's not so light. Because honestly, when you are looking at the plant itself, it's not really that light on the bottom, but this is sort of how we have to layer. And then again, this is a glazing technique when we're going to go back over this dry part, and we're going to go back over it and deepen it up. So now we're going into that glazing layering technique. And if you wanted to put some lines in there in the petals, they have very slight lines, you can do that. And you can create some details with layering. And I'm just using this brush just because it's, you know, I have it. You could use a smaller detail brush, but now you're really starting to see how to layer and how that works. And again, not patient. I'm not patient, am I? And yeah, you can make it as full as you want. And again, if you want to go in, you don't need all these different brushes. If you want to go in and just tap those edges, if you want, whoops, that one's got some yellow on it, but that is pretty on it. If you want to just tap those edges out and sort of blend them to soften them, you can do that as well. You can see how soft. So that one was a little bit too dry. This one probably a little too dry. But yes, that's how you're going to soften those edges. And you can fill in that zinnia, make it nice and full if you want. And then you'll have this dry area here. You can go in and you can add some details if you have like a gouache color. This is another great way to layer, which we will be going into adding some whites and gouaches in a future lesson. But I'm just going to show you because it is part of layering as well. And just put that right on top. And you can put details in there if you want to go in with a bit of a darker color for the center and stipple that in there. And that's how you're going to create that depth. I'm just going to add in 1 or 2 leaves just to finish the piece. And we're just going to add in just 1 little leaf here. And see how I just did that outline? I want to show you how you can sort of soften the outline inside. So you just run that damp brush right inside, and you're going to be able to have a darker outline and a lighter inside. It's a super fun way to paint these. I'll just do a few. Same technique. Just tap that inside, and we're sort of blending that harsh line. You know, it doesn't have to be the edge, it can be the inside. That one might look a little funny, but when we put a line in it, we can go back in and layer once that's dry. Same here. So yeah, it doesn't have to be super detailed. Maybe I should put another pet. It looks so uneven, and I know it's just a demo, but oof, we need something right here. And we'll tap. They've got those long, slender, pointy leaves. All right, that's a little better. So now let's hit this one. Okay. And then I'm just gonna go in with a little bit of a darker green, more saturated, less water, and add that line down the middle. And that's how you're going to layer in your leaves. If you want to do those little lines in there, depends on the type of flower it is, right? So whatever their leaves have, these ones are just going to have the one down the center, and that is it. This is how you layer. This is how you create those really soft edges. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for painting with me today. Tomorrow's lesson is all about transparency versus opacity in watercolor. It sounds boring, but it's actually a total game changer. So make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and I will see you back here again tomorrow.